Compositions are great. No, not those compositions. I mean, they're great too, but they don't help us build any visual effects. Now, go on now, this really has gotten awful enough. So far, we've only used compositions for a very simple purpose, as container for our visual effects. Now, technically that is all they are. However, they can be used to solve a variety of different problems when you're building more complex visual effects. For one, they can be used to group together different layers or to reuse elements within and across your compositions. So let's jump into Adobe After Effects and check out some of the more advanced uses for compositions. Let's return to our thieving clones effect that we created in the masking lesson for this course. And while this effect looks pretty cool already, let's add a little bit more magic to it. And by magic, I mean some particles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some particles floating off the nacho back after the first clone placed it on the ground. And I'm going to add particles to the nacho back as it's lying on the side of the couch, just kind of to indicate that magical transition of the nacho back from one clone to the next. For that, let's import another clip into our project, and in the course materials you will find an effects folder, and in the effects folder you will find a nacho particles movie clip. So let's bring that into our project and let's drag it into our composition. Now you can drop this right into your composition and it will get placed at the beginning of your timeline, or let's not do that right now. Instead, let's scrub to the position where we want the effect to start, which is right here after the first clone places the nacho bag on the ground. Let's grab the nacho particles movie clip, and rather than dropping it into our layer window, let's drop it into our timeline and let's drop it at the current cursor position, so right where we want the actual effect to start. This is going to add the clip at the position we dropped it off, so timing wise this is a whole lot easier. Let me move this a little bit, and it's a little bit hard to see because it sits right over the second clone. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, actually drag this layer down over the nacho bag so we can kind of check this out a little bit more easily. And that's actually just a really simple particle effect. Let me actually drag this and align this a little bit better with the nacho bag, so it kind of looks like the particles are coming out of the nacho bag. I'm also going to time it so the particles start just after the bag has been dropped off. Cool, that actually looks all right. And then the particles stop when the second clone snatches up that nacho bag. Maybe I'll move them up just a tiny bit. Feel free to adjust this in any way that you want. Next, let's change the color of those particles to match the nacho bag a little bit better. For that, let's come into the Effects and Presets panel and search for the tint effect. And you should find the tint effect under your color correction. So let's just grab that and apply it to the nacho particles layer. And in the effect settings for the tint effect, let's just change the map white to property. And you can either just change the color to anything you want, or you can just take this little color picker over on the right hand side and just select the color of the nacho bag. And I prefer using the color picker because you're more likely to pick a color that matches your actual footage. So let's just pick a fairly light-ish red. Let's hit OK. And so now the particles are nice and red. And finally, let's select the nacho particles layer and change the blend mode from normal over to add. Cool, that's looking pretty nice already. Let's make this a little bit more magical though by just adding more particles. For that, I'm simply going to reuse my nacho particles layer. So let's select the layer, press Ctrl D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate this layer. Press S to reveal the scale property. And over on the right hand side, I'm actually going to click onto this little chain link icon here to untick that. So I'm actually unlinking the width and the height. So the width and height will no longer scale uniformly and I can change them independent on one another. And what I want to do is actually just want to change the X scale to -100. So I'm essentially just flipping the layer horizontally. So now I have a second copy of my particles that just flipped horizontally. And in order to make sure they don't look, too matchy, I'm actually just going to offset this layer time-wise just a little bit, just so it doesn't look too uniform. And maybe I'll move the second layer up just a little bit. Cool, that looks pretty nice. But now let's say you're not quite happy with the color of your particles. Obviously, you can select your nacho layer, come into the tint effect, use the color picker right here to maybe change this over to more of a yellow. But now we only changed half the particles because we have a second layer with the same effect that now also needs to be changed. So we're kind of back at the same issue where we were trying to apply the same effect to multiple layers, and This time we cannot solve it with an adjustment layer. The reason we can't solve it with an adjustment layer in this case is because if I create an adjustment layer in my composition and place it at the very top, it's going to apply those effects to every single layer, including the footage layers that I have in here. I really just want to apply a single effect, a single tint effect, to both of these natural layers together as a group. You can group together any number of layers from your current composition into a new nested composition. That process is called pre-composing. So first off, let's remove the tint effect from both of our natural particle layers. So let's select one, delete the tint effect, select the other one and delete the tint effect. And let's group these two layers together into a new composition. For that, make sure both of those natural particle layers are selected. And you can come up into the main menu and under Layer, you will find an option to pre-compose. You can also use the shortcut key Ctrl Shift and C or Command Shift and C on a Mac. I'm just going to use this menu option. And this is going to pop open the pre-compose options. First, you want to give your composition a useful name. Let's call this one Natural Particles Comp. And then you will see two different options. One of them is grayed out right now, so don't worry about these ones too much for now. Just make sure that the option is selected for Move All Attributes into the new composition. And that should be your only option because we are pre-composing multiple layers. But as I said, I'll get to that in just a minute. And this, I believe, is an option in the later versions of Adobe After Effects to adjust the composition duration to actually match the length of those layers. So you'll get a composition that is exactly as long as those two layers together. I'm going to untick that simply because that is going to resemble more what you get in earlier versions of Adobe After Effects. If you have this option, I highly recommend always use it. The reason I'm leaving it off is because I know that some people may not have the latest version of After Effects and I want everyone to follow along in the same way. So let's hit OK. And that has now created a new composition called Natural Particles Comp, which, by the way, if you go to your project panel, you'll find this new Natural Particles Comp right in here because it's just a composition, just like your Thieving Clones composition. It's the same thing. It's just nested inside the Thieving Clones. So in our Thieving Clones comp, we now have a single layer, which is this nested composition. And if you double click on this composition layer here or in your project panel, let's just click onto it in the timeline. So just double click that. You'll jump into that composition. So you see right here, you have a new tab for your Natural Particles Comp, which is now in that Natural Particles Comp. You can click back to the Thieving Clones or back to the Natural Particles Comp. And this now contains our two layers. They're still in exactly the same position as they were before. Let me actually just move down, zoom out a tiny bit so you can see. So those are our two particle layers. And if you go back to the Thieving Clones, well, there's all our particles, except now they're actually grouped into a single layer. You can disable the visibility together, and now any effects that you apply to this layer are essentially being applied to everything that's inside it. So let's jump back to the Thieving Clones, select the Natural Particles Comp, let's apply a tint effect to that, and let's change the map white to property, again to like an orangey red, and this will now affect all particles together. Maybe I'll make this just a little bit more brighter red. It just looks a little bit nicer to me, but again, feel free to change this to anything you want. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that those particles don't feel quite as bright anymore. And the reason that is happening is that even though inside our Natural Particles Comp we have these two particle layers and their blend mode is set to additive, in our Thieving Clones composition, the Natural Particles Comp layer's blend mode is actually set to normal. So let's change the blend mode of this layer over to Add, and our particles are nice and bright again. Also, now that all of our particles are grouped together in this new comp, we can apply other effects. So let's apply a stylized glow effect to this layer. Let's tweak the settings a little bit, push out the radius, maybe make it a little bit more intense as well, just to add a little bit more flair, a little bit more energy to these particles. Feel free to tweak this in any way that you want. For now, let's come back to those pre-compose options and go through them in a little bit more detail. Let's jump into the Natural Particles Comp simply by double-clicking on it, and in here you will have your two natural particles layers. And let's come into the Effects and Presets panel, search for the tint effect, and let's apply the color correction tint effect to just one of those particle layers. Let's change the map white to property to anything you want. I'm just going to go with a little bit of blue. Let me disable the visibility on the other nacho particles layer as well. I really just want to go over a few of those options for pre-composing. Now, if I open up the position and the scale of this nacho particles layer, you will see that we've moved this layer around, right? It's not straight in the middle of our composition. We've scaled this to flip it horizontally as well, and now we've got a tint effect on it. If you select this one layer, and you come up into Layer and select Pre-Compose, again, we can create a new composition and nest this single layer in that new composition. Let's just call this one Test Comp. And now you should have both options enabled. You can say to either leave all attributes in the Nacho Particles comp, or you can choose to move all attributes into the new composition. What this means is if you select to leave all attributes in Nacho Particles comp, so remember this layer that we're pre-composing has been positioned and scaled, it's got an effect on it. If you leave all attributes in the Nacho Particles comp, it will create a new composition with this layer, but leave the changes to position, scale, and the effect in here. It won't actually move those effects into that composition. So to try that out, let's simply hit OK with leave all attributes in Nacho Particles comp. And well, you now have a new composition. And sure enough, if you jump into test comp by double clicking onto it, you find your Nacho Particles, but on this layer, there is no effect. Also, the position and scale, it's 100, and it sits exactly in the middle of your composition. So no transforms have been applied to this layer at all. However, in your Nacho Particles comp, on this test comp layer, you still have that tint effect. And if you open up the position and the scale, those changes to position and scale have actually been applied to this new composition. So it essentially grouped that layer into a new composition, so you can do whatever you want within that new test comp. But all of those transformations, all of the effects, haven't been moved into that new composition. Let's undo that with Ctrl Z or Command Z. And again, let's pre-compose this layer with Ctrl Shift and C or Command Shift and C. And I highly recommend you get used to those shortcuts. They just make life so much easier. Again, let's call this test comp. And this time, let's choose to move all attributes into the new composition. Let's hit OK. And now our test comp itself is positioned right in the center. Also, if you open up the position and the scale, you can see that that's just a default and there's no tint effect on this composition. However, if you now dig into this test comp, on this Nacho particle layer, you will find it has the tint effect and it has the changes to position and scale. So all of those attributes, the scale transforms, the position and the effects have been moved into this new composition. So that is what that option is for. And those options are really important to understand because sometimes you want to keep all of those effects up in the parent composition. Quite often you just want to nest them down in the child composition. Let's return to the Nacho Particles comp and undo that. Let's delete the tint effect as well. Re-enable the visibility of the other Nacho Particles layer. So we're back to where we started. And now if you select all layers with Ctrl A or Command A and pre-compose those, Ctrl Shift and C, well, we can create a new composition with those two layers grouped together like we did before. And the reason the option to leave all attributes in your Nacho Particle comp is disabled is because you have more than a single layer selected. There is no way to group those together but leave all of their effects applied because you'll end up with a single layer rather than multiples. So that's why if you pre-compose multiple layers, you will not have the options to leave attributes in the Nacho Particles comp. And quite frankly, moving all attributes into the new composition is 99.999% of the time exactly what you want. Let's not do that, however. Let's return to our Thieving Clones comp and let's look at the second reason pre-composing your layers is awesome. Let's zoom back out and we have this cool little particle effect here, and unfortunately this layer is actually really long and for the most part it's entirely empty. If you double click into it, up until we reach these particle effects, there's literally nothing on either side of it. So one of the things I personally really like to do, I like to come in to the very beginning here where the particle effects start, jump back up to my Thieving Clones, and you'll see the timeline indicator is exactly at the right point. And I'm just going to drag this side corner in. You can hold down Shift to kind of snap it to where the timeline indicator is. Let's move forward a little bit to where the particle effect has ended. And you can either drag this end in or you can press Alt and right square bracket with the layer selected to snap it to the point. It just kind of marks that this is the part of that layer that is actually visible. Just makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Because what I'm going to do is I'm now going to duplicate my Nacho Particles comp. And I'm going to move this effect over to where the second clone places the nacho bag on the corner of the couch. So let's move this over, because I know the effect starts right about here. Let's drag this up. Let's scale this down a little bit as well, because the nacho bag is a little bit further away. So essentially we have a second particle effect occurring on the nacho bag right there, maybe just a little bit bigger. Cool, so we have one particle effect right here after the first clone places it, and another particle effect right about there. Now here's the other great thing of pre-composing your layers to form groups. Those groups are reusable. Both of these nacho particles comp layers refer to the same composition, so if you change this content of this composition, it will affect both effects. It will affect the first particle effect as well as the second one, because both of those layers refer to the same composition. Let's do that now and jump into the nacho particles comp. Let's go back a little bit. Let's create a new adjustment layer. Come into the Effects and Presets panel and let's search for the Turbulent Displace effect. Let's apply it to that adjustment layer, and obviously make sure the adjustment layer sits at the very top of your composition so it affects all of the particle layers underneath it. Let's shrink down the size to maybe around 20, and the amount can probably be about 50. So what we kind of have this little weaving and distortion effect happening on our particles. And the other thing I might do, just to vary it a little bit, I might actually apply a glow effect to only one of these layers, just so that one set of these particles is slightly bigger and slightly more intense than the other one. So let's select a glow effect and apply a stylized glow to just one of those particle layers. Maybe I'll push the radius up a bit more intensity as well. So we're kind of just creating two separate groups of particles. One are a bit more intense, the other ones are just a little bit more muted. This kind of adds a little bit more variance into this effect. And now, if I return to my thieving clones, I can see that those changes have been applied to the first particle effect and to the second one. So pre-composing your layers and creating nested compositions is great for grouping layers together and managing effects across all of those layers, as well as creating little sets, little reusable elements of visual effect pieces that you can then use across your entire project. You can nest your compositions as deep as you want to. The only thing you won't be able to do is create a circular nesting. So I wouldn't be able to bring the thieving clones comp into the nacho particles comp, because then the nacho particle comp would depend on the thieving clones comp, which depends on the nacho particles comp, and that just doesn't work. But other than that, you can nest any layers in any way that you want. Leave the effects at the parent, move them down, nest it as deep as you want to, and this unlocks real potential to create some really intricate and really cool looking visual effects.